Hello and welcome to Nervous System Part 1. This is the introduction to the nervous system. My name is Debbie Richards. You'll notice really quickly that I am from the South, actually from Texas. So pardon my southern drawl as we go through here. I'll try to enunciate clearly. You're going to need your student pages that have a place for you to take some notes. You'll need something to write with. If at any time you want to repeat or review something, then please do. And save your questions, write them down, make notes so that when you are with your teacher, you can get those answered. So let's get started. As you look at this image, do you see Dr. Rufus B. Weaver? He is pointing to a piece of work. What body system do you see? Can you tell? What he's actually pointing to is the nervous system of Harriet. She donated her body to science when she passed away. She had actually worked for Dr. Weaver, and he was an anatomy professor, and one of the things that he wanted to do was isolate the human nervous system so that you could actually see what nerves look like. And at that point in time, it was thought to be an impossible task. But he very painstakingly, working in his own basement over a series of just about 5 months, he took all the muscle, the bone, the vessels, he took the lymphatic system, the kidneys, he took everything away and teased it apart, leaving behind the very delicate and tender nerves of Harriet. And so it's a museum display, and you can see that Harriet is displayed behind this glass casing, and that was an important work that Dr. Weaver accomplished, actually isolating the nerves of the nervous system so that they could be studied, traced, and just help expand our understanding of how our nervous system works. And so as an AP Biology student, you are supposed to have an essential knowledge that animals have nervous systems that detect external and internal signals, as well as transmit and integrate that information, and then produce some sort of response. So when we look at the actual role of the nervous system, it interacts with the senses and your internal body system to coordinate whatever response you're going to have to the incoming information. And then that response may be a glandular secretion, it might be a muscle contraction, some sort of movement, but there would be a response to the information that's been brought in to your nervous system. When you consider this slide, as you look from left to right, top to bottom, what trend do you notice? You may see the hydra with this very simple nerve net, and you'll see an increase in the complexity of the nervous system. Likely you also noticed that we start to have these little condensed areas of nervous tissue. They're called ganglia. And then finally, you probably noticed that in the front area, the brain sort of seems to take up more space, be more enlarged. You oftentimes then will see sensory structures like eyes or antennae or ears, olfaction receptors. And so this concentration of nervous tissue in the anterior region of an organism is cephalization. What do you think would be the advantages of having cephalization? Why would there be an advantage to having nervous tissue concentrated in an anterior area? Well, it's going to give the organism the ability to detect its surroundings quickly so that it can recognize the approaching predator, or maybe sense food in its environment, or water, or change in temperature. It allows for visualization. You'll see that there's nerve tissue even in the eyes, in the ears. All of that allows for the organism to have an adaptive advantage, as opposed to one like the Hydra that doesn't know up from down, side from side, and can't really have an immediate response to approaching predator organisms. So when we look at a human's nervous system, you'll see we basically have two branching components. There's the central nervous system. It really has just the brain and the spine. Runs sort of down the center of your body, center of your head, so it almost forms the axis here. And so that's the integration portion of our nervous system. Then there's the peripheral nervous system, which includes all those nerves that run to and from those sensory organs. Then all of our nerves that lead into the spine from different parts of our body. So all of the sensory and reception as well as response nerves that are outside the brain and spine are considered part of the peripheral nervous system. Just basically, this image shows the basic function of our nervous system. You detect some sort of incoming stimulus through your receptor. Then that sensory input is sent to the central nervous system where it's going to be integrated. And then that integration typically leads to some sort of output. In this case, there's a motor output, and so the muscle may contract to allow this person to run. And so we have reception of the input, integration, and then there's some sort of output. So you see the central nervous system works in conjunction with the peripheral nervous system to cause our effectors to react to some stimuli that was collected by the sensory receptor. The shortest pathway of integration would be called a reflex arc. So let me just use that to show you the basic operation of the nervous system. Some sort of stimulus is detected, in this case a pain receptor. That pain receptor sends the information by way of a neuron to the spinal cord. It's kind of hard to see that this is a cross section of your spine, and inside there is your spinal cord. It is laced with interneurons. So the information comes in, it is processed by the spinal cord, and then a motor output is caused as the motor neuron activates the muscle and causes the muscle to contract and remove the hand from the pain here. So that's a really short and very efficient pathway, as we see in a reflex arc. You probably can think of some other reflexes like blinking when something comes towards your face, or the gag reflex. We have lots of reflexes that the stimulus is detected very quickly, and instead of the information being processed all the way up in the brain, there's an interneuron that can just immediately connect to the muscle or the response part, whether it's a gland or a muscle, and cause that reaction really quickly to hopefully save a limb or save any additional damage in this case. So our reflexes are really short neural pathways, but they demonstrate the basic sensory reception, central nervous system integration, and then motor response that could be generated from that. So the basic functional unit of our nervous system is a neuron. And here on the right of the screen, you'll see a dendrite, the cell body, all of the components labeled on a particular neuron. This is a generic neuron. This particular one has a connection to the next neuron shown in this diagram. But the way that this cell is specialized allows it to detect information through its dendrites, assimilate that information, generate transmission, and then send that communication to a second cell. So in that way, the neuron functions as the basic unit of the nervous system. Now, not all neurons look like the one that I showed you on that screen. Sometimes they will have their cell body in a little bit different arrangement. They can have this really branched reception area like we see in an interneuron. We could have a motor neuron, which looked a whole lot like the bipolar neuron I just showed you. But either way, we see some really common structures. So neurons are really specialized for their particular job that they do, and that is to conduct impulses, either to the central nervous system or away from the central nervous system. And there are three main types. Obviously, those that are used for sensing in the environment, and then the interneurons that relay the information then to a motor neuron. So where are the neurons in this reflex arc? If you look at this picture for just a moment, where are the neurons? Hopefully you said that B is a neuron, C is a different type of neuron, and then D is also a neuron. So we have a sensory neuron, an interneuron at C, and a motor neuron at D. Let's take a minute to think about the sequence that neurons would be arranged in. Let me read this to you. Choose the correct pathway of information flow through neurons while taking a test, starting with reading the question and ending with marking the answer. I hope that you pick C. We have to sense the information. You're going to think about the content. Then your brain will send a signal through a motor neuron to the effector, which in this case would be the muscles of your hand, as you bubble in an answer or select an answer. So that's a typical sequence of the pathway of flow. So let's return to our general neuron. If you compare this neuron to a typical animal cell, do you see some structural differences? Some very different structures. There are dendrites, which are these little processes that stick off the receiving end of the cell. Probably notice this really long, skinny piece of the neuron. That's the axon. That's not found in a typical animal cell. However, a nucleus, that's pretty typical for us. A generalized animal cell is composed or compared to this really specialized cell. The neuron is highly specialized for its job. The signal comes in, is processed, collected, an impulse is generated. The impulse then would move down that neuron. So a typical neuron has this cell body. It has an axon, and then generally several dendrites. So if we just look anatomically at what we would find in a neuron, where the impulses come in, what are these little processes called? I hope you're thinking dendrite. Then there's that nucleus. Number 3 is the axon. Takes the impulse away from the general cell body and is going to deliver the information to the next neuron. 4 is an area or a region called the axon hillock, and this is where an impulse is going to start. The action potential would be generated here. 5 shows us just the basic cell body. So information comes in, and if there is a large enough input of information, then an action potential would be generated, or basically a message would be sent down the length of the axon. So a typical neuron has a cell body. it has axon, and then it has dendrites. And many axons are surrounded with this protein called myelin that's secreted by some specialized cells that are called Schwann cells. So you can see how the little cell right here, there's nucleus, and then the cell is sort of this light blue color. And it secretes a protein, or produces a protein, I should say, a protein called myelin, and then that causes this area of the neuron to be insulated, sort of like an electrical wire would be insulated. And so that conduction then only has to occur in these little gaps along here. And so impulse generation would start, and then conduction would happen at this gap, it would jump to the next gap. And so because only small portions of this neuron actually have to conduct information or generate this charge gradient, then these cells that are myelinated, that have a myelinated axon, tend to conduct information really quickly. And so they only have to conduct at these little nodes, and so the information can transfer very swiftly down the length of the neuron. The only portions that have to actually do the job of a neuron then, where we have this charge or depolarization taking place, would be in those little gaps. So this is called saltatory conduction because the impulse can kind of jump down the cell, and that comes from a word saltaire, which means that skipping or jumping. And so when we look at these cells that have a myelinated sheath, that myelination allows them to have the adaptation for speed. Speed's always good when we're looking at trying to have a really fast response. So let's summarize that. Think back to Harriet. Good old Harriet. How are the nerves that you see, how are they related to neurons? They are similar. Nerves are actually bundles of neurons, and most of the length of these nerves is from the actual length of the axon. A nerve, if I were to cut across one of them, Dr. Weaver wouldn't like that, but if I were to cut across one of those, I would see several axons as that information is being transmitted from all those areas that are serviced by that particular neuron. So next time we're going to look at how that information actually travels, and so in part 2 we'll consider actually the process, the molecular level process of neuron conduction.